For 25 years, one question haunted the tightly knit streets of Queens, New York. What really happened to Emily Hartman, a 13-year-old girl who vanished into the night and never came home? It's a case cold enough to freeze the heart, yet sharp enough to cut through decades of silence. Emily was supposed to be safe, a kid with homework, dreams of summer, a mother waiting for her laugh at the dinner table. But on an evening in 1998, something irreparable broke. Her family searched, the police searched, the community held its breath, and then nothing. Until now. Because something has just been uncovered. An arrest so unexpected, so wrenching, it sent shock through people who thought this story was over. If you think stories like this should never be forgotten, hit subscribe right now. Because the sad reality is, most people move on, but families like Emily's never do. Don't be one of the people who scroll past their pain. There are moments in our lives when we think we know everything, but then we discover one small buried piece of truth that demands attention. In this story, that piece surfaced after all those years, something nobody saw until someone finally looked. And when you stay with me until the end of this video, you will see that detail, the one that changes everything. You'll understand exactly why the whole community gasped, why Emily's parents never stopped hoping, and why justice came when so many had forgotten. Before diving deep into the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on the latest cases. You'll hear things that make your blood run cold. You'll feel the weight of lost time. You'll witness how hope turned into desperation, and how an ordinary neighborhood hid something nobody expected. Emily Hartman was 13, schoolgirl, daughter, friend. She was supposed to come home that night, and for decades, every minute without answers felt like punishment. But this isn't just Emily's story. It's a story about what happens when systems fail, when evidence is overlooked, when people who loved her had nothing left but questions. So here's what we will uncover together. Who stood by Emily the night she disappeared? The clues that everyone dismissed, the mistake that hid the truth, the breakthrough that forced confession, and the final moment when the person most trusted was revealed to be the one responsible. What drove them to do it, how they stayed hidden for so long, and whether the justice Emily's family always hoped for is enough now. Stay with me, because by the time we reach the end of this case, you'll see how even the smallest piece of evidence, the faintest DNA trace, or the memories of someone forgotten can shatter decades of silence. And you'll see justice, not perfect, not without scars, but finally earned. But here's what makes this case so devastating, and why you need to hear every second of it. Emily Hartman wasn't just another face on a missing poster. She was a child who should have been safe, a daughter who was loved, a friend whose laughter still echoes in the memories of those who knew her. She had dreams that stretched ahead of her, the kind of innocent plans every 13-year-old makes. Weekend sleepovers, favorite songs, hopes of high school, and everything that comes after. She was grounded, cared for, and surrounded by people who should have protected her. And yet, on a night in 1998, all of that collapsed. She stepped out into her neighborhood, Queens, New York, a place where families knew one another and kids played outside, and she never came home. For years, the question clawed at everyone's mind. Who could have done this? And how could they have lived side by side with Emily's family, maybe even exchanged polite greetings on the street, while carrying the secret of what they had done? This wasn't a sprawling mystery lost in the chaos of a city with millions. This was a tight community. Neighbors knew neighbors. Parents trusted other parents. And yet, for 25 years, the truth stayed buried. The silence was almost louder than the crime itself. Think about that for a moment. How does a child vanish, and for decades no answers emerge? How do investigators follow every lead, question dozens of people, turn neighborhoods upside down, and still come up empty? And perhaps the most terrifying question of all, how do you live with yourself if you were the one responsible? Could you sit in the crowd at a vigil, light a candle, watch her parents weep, and still keep your mouth shut? Could you knock on their door and say you were sorry for their loss, while knowing you were the very reason for it? These are the questions that festered in Queens for more than 2 decades, and so the mystery only grew heavier with time. The police worked the case until they couldn't anymore. The media ran stories until they stopped. The community whispered theories late at night, each one darker than the last. But in the end, silence became the answer everyone lived with. Until, years later, a single forgotten piece of evidence resurfaced and changed everything. That moment, that discovery, shattered 25 years of quiet despair. It brought the truth roaring back into the lives of people who had convinced themselves they might never know. So here's what we're about to uncover together. Who killed Emily Hartman? Why did justice take so long? And what detail, so small yet so damning, finally cracked open a case that had been sealed by time itself? These aren't just questions about one girl's tragedy. They're questions about how justice works, about whether communities can ever really trust the faces they see every day, and about how a secret can survive right in plain sight. By the end of this story, you will know the answers. You'll know the name of the person everyone overlooked. You'll know why Emily's parents carried unanswered questions for a quarter of a century. And you'll know the detail, the tiny, overlooked clue that forced the truth into daylight. That's the payoff for staying until the very end. Because this story is not just about closure. It's about how the smallest thread, pulled at the right time, can unravel the darkest secrets. And let me warn you, you may think you'll remember this case without hitting subscribe, but when the next twist drops, you'll miss it. And honestly, ask yourself this: could you live with missing the very moment justice finally arrives? Families like Emily's waited decades for it. Don't be the person who scrolls past and forgets. Stay here, follow every revelation, and let the weight of this story remind you why these cases matter. Because Emily's story is not just a tragedy frozen in 1998. It's a test of memory, of justice, and of the people who thought their silence could last forever. Emily Hartman was 13 years old in the fall of 1998. 13. An age balanced between childhood and the first glimpses of adolescence. She still kept stuffed animals lined along the edge of her bed, a collection of mismatched teddy bears and dolls she refused to let her mother give away. But she had also just started writing in a diary, the kind with a flimsy little lock, because she wanted a place to keep her secrets. She was growing, like every kid her age, caught between innocence and independence. Friends remember her laugh first, loud, unguarded, the kind of laugh that carried across the school hallway and made teachers smile even when they were trying to be stern. Teachers said she had a curiosity that made her stand out, raising her hand not just to answer, but to ask questions that made the whole class pause. She loved reading, especially mysteries, a detail that feels heavier now, given how her life became one. She played the flute in the school band, not because she had a passion for music, but because her best friend had joined and she didn't want to be left behind. That was Emily, never the loudest in the room, but always wanting to belong, always wanting to be near people she trusted. Her family lived in a modest 2-story house in Queens. Her father worked long shifts as a transit operator, while her mother picked up part-time jobs between caring for Emily and her younger brother. They were not wealthy, but they had stability, warmth, and the kind of closeness that meant Sunday dinners together and bedtime routines that ended with the same phrase, "Be safe, come home." Emily's parents were protective, sometimes overly so, because they knew the world was changing. Crime rates in New York were higher in the 90s than they are today, and news stories about children disappearing haunted every parent. But Queens had its own rhythm. It was a neighborhood where kids still rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, where block parties spilled into the sidewalks, where neighbors shared tools and traded gossip over chain-link fences. Emily's childhood was rooted in that trust, a trust that would later be shattered. Her friends say she was endlessly loyal. If you were having a bad day, Emily was the one who noticed, the one who would sit with you even if it meant being late for something else. She had that kind of empathy that adults often overlook in children, a sensitivity to the moods of others. Her mother said she had a stubborn streak too. If she thought something wasn't fair, she would argue until she wore you down. That spirit, that spark, is part of what makes her story so hard to carry. Because when you picture her, you don't see a headline or a case file. You see a child living a life that should have been ordinary. Queens in the late 1990s was alive with contrast. Street vendors lined the sidewalks, selling roasted nuts in paper cones. Music poured out of corner stores, everything from hip-hop to salsa to the latest pop hits. Kids walked to school in packs, backpacks slung low, sneakers squeaking on the pavement. The subway rattled in the distance, graffiti still etched into some of the cars. Families gathered on stoops in the evening to talk while the smell of home-cooked dinners drifted from open windows. It was noisy, crowded, imperfect, but it was home. It was the backdrop to Emily's childhood, and it was supposed to be safe. That's the cruelest part. Her disappearance didn't just steal her from her family. It shattered the illusion of safety for everyone who lived there. Looking back now, people search their memories for signs, for moments that might have hinted at what was coming. One neighbor recalls how Emily sometimes stopped by their apartment after school to say hello, always polite, always smiling. Another remembers a man, someone familiar to the block, who often lingered nearby when children were walking home. At the time, nobody thought twice. He was part of the scenery, someone who blended into the background of everyday life. But hindsight is sharp, and decades later, those same details feel like shadows that should have been noticed. That's the unsettling truth. The danger wasn't far away. It was close, wrapped in familiarity. Emily's last diary entry, found years later, was a simple one. She wrote about a math test she thought she failed, a television show she wanted to watch, and a line about a neighbor who had offered to walk her home. She wrote his name without fear, without hesitation, because to her he wasn't a threat. He was someone she trusted, someone her family trusted. That trust, as we now know, was misplaced. But in 1998, there was no reason for suspicion. There was only the daily rhythm of life, the comfort of routine, the assumption that children could step outside and return home without consequence. That's what makes this case so haunting. It wasn't random. It wasn't the act of a stranger who slipped into the neighborhood unnoticed. The person who took Emily wasn't a faceless figure in the night. He was someone who had been there all along, someone who smiled in the daylight, someone whose presence felt ordinary until it wasn't. And when the truth finally surfaced, years later, it was that betrayal, not just the crime itself, that shook the community to its core. By understanding who Emily was, by seeing her life in detail, you feel the weight of what was lost. She was a child on the cusp of becoming a young woman, filled with energy, curiosity, and love. She had parents who adored her, a brother who looked up to her, friends who couldn't imagine a world without her laugh. And yet, all of that was stolen in one night. As we move forward in this story, remember Emily not as a headline, not as a statistic, but as a girl who deserved so much more than what happened to her. Because only then can we understand why, when the truth finally came out, it didn't just bring closure. It reopened wounds that had never healed. It was Friday, October 16th, 1998. A crisp fall evening in Queens, the kind where the air felt sharper, where the wind carried the scent of roasted chestnuts from corner vendors, and the faint buzz of weekend excitement hung in the streets. For Emily Hartman, it should have been an ordinary night. She had stayed late at school for band practice, flute case tucked under her arm as she walked with a friend toward the neighborhood blocks she knew so well. Her route home was familiar. The same cracked sidewalks, the same graffiti-tagged walls, the same friendly wave from the corner grocer who always reminded her to tell her mother hello. She was less than 10 minutes from her front door. Just 10 minutes. That's all it should have taken. Her friend split off first, turning down her own street, calling back, "See you tomorrow." Emily waved, adjusted her backpack, and kept walking. The sky had dimmed quickly. the sun slipping away faster than usual that night, shadows stretching across the pavement. Streetlights flickered on. Emily wasn't frightened. She had walked this way hundreds of times. But this time, someone was waiting. Someone who knew her routine. Someone she trusted enough not to be alarmed by. Her parents were at home preparing dinner. Her mother was setting the table, her father flipping through the evening news, her younger brother sprawled on the floor with his toys. They expected the familiar sound of the front door opening, Emily's voice calling out, "I'm home." But that moment never came. Minutes turned to an hour. Dinner grew cold. Her mother called Emily's friend, who said she had seen her walking only blocks from the house. Panic set in quickly, because this wasn't like Emily. She wasn't the kind of child who disappeared without calling. She wasn't rebellious. She wasn't careless. Something was wrong. The first phone call was to neighbors. Had anyone seen her? Maybe she stopped to talk with someone. Maybe she went to the corner store. No, nobody had. The second call was to the police. The officer on the line listened, but the response was cautious, almost routine. Maybe she got delayed. Maybe she's with a friend. But her mother's voice was frantic. She knew. She knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. Her daughter should have been home hours ago. And as midnight approached, that truth became impossible to ignore. The search began almost instantly. Parents, neighbors, friends poured into the streets with flashlights, calling her name into the dark. "Emily! Emily!" The sound carried through the blocks, bouncing against brick walls and empty alleys. Windows opened as residents leaned out to ask what was happening. Flyers were quickly printed with her school photo, taped to lampposts and bodega doors. Police cars idled at the curbs, their red and blue lights flashing across the night. The community, once vibrant with the ordinary noise of a Friday evening, was suddenly gripped with dread. Her mother stood at the front door, phone in hand, calling again and again. Her father drove the same streets repeatedly, circling blocks, pulling over to peer down alleys, praying to see a glimpse of her silhouette. Neighbors left porch lights on as a signal, as if light itself could guide her home. But no matter how many streets they searched, no matter how many people they asked, there was no sign. Emily had vanished. As the night dragged into early morning, fear began to mutate into something heavier. Theories swirled. Had she been taken by a stranger? Had she accepted a ride from someone she trusted? Was she hurt, trapped, calling out where no one could hear her? Every possibility was worse than the last. Police questioned her classmates, retraced her route, asked about anyone unusual hanging around. But this was Queens. The unusual often blended into the everyday. A man lingering on a corner, a car idling too long, footsteps behind you at night. All of it was normal, until suddenly it wasn't. Her younger brother, too young to fully grasp the nightmare unfolding, kept asking, "When's Emily coming home?" The silence that followed was unbearable. Her parents stayed awake all night, pacing, making calls, holding on to the hope that at any moment the phone would ring with good news. But it didn't. When dawn broke, it only confirmed the unthinkable. Emily had not made it home. The following days were chaos. Media trucks parked on the streets, reporters asking neighbors what they saw, what they heard. Police set up a command post. Volunteers combed through empty lots, wooded patches, abandoned buildings. Search dogs traced scents that led nowhere. Every lead became a dead end. And yet, there were whispers of someone seen near her route that night, of a familiar face too quick to explain where they had been. Nobody wanted to believe it. Not then. Not when trust was still stronger than suspicion. For Emily's parents, the hours stretched into days, and the days into weeks. They left her bedroom untouched, the bed neatly made, her stuffed animals lined up as if waiting for her to return. Her diary sat on the nightstand, its tiny lock unopened, her handwriting frozen in time. The phone became their lifeline, each ring a surge of hope that dissolved into despair when it was only another reporter or another neighbor checking in. The community clung to each other, but unease began to spread. If Emily could vanish so suddenly, so close to home, What did that mean for every other child? Parents began walking their kids to school, locking doors earlier, watching strangers with suspicion. Safety, once assumed, had been ripped away. And through it all, the question grew louder. Where is Emily Hartman? Her disappearance was not a quiet fading into the night. It was a rupture, a wound that never closed. Every lead chased, every rumor investigated, every prayer whispered felt like a thread leading nowhere. And yet, what nobody knew then was that the answer was closer than they ever imagined. The person responsible wasn't far away. He wasn't a stranger in the shadows. He was someone trusted, someone who had stood among them, someone who had blended so seamlessly into the community that suspicion barely brushed against him. But that truth would not come for decades. On that October night, all anyone knew was this. Emily Hartman walked a familiar path home, and she never arrived. That night, Emily Hartman vanished into the shadows of Queens, and no one would ever see her alive again. The hours after Emily Hartman's disappearance were chaotic, and they set the tone for everything that would follow. The police presence in Queens grew heavy. By Saturday morning, marked patrol cars lined the blocks where Emily was last seen. Detectives in plain clothes knocked on doors, asking the same desperate questions. Had anyone seen her walking home? Did anyone notice a car idling near the corner? Did anyone hear a scream? But for all the questions, there were no clear answers. Every detail, no matter how small, became a potential lead. A neighbor claimed she saw a dark sedan pull away from the curb just minutes after Emily should have passed by. Another insisted she heard voices arguing near the alley. But when detectives followed up, nothing solid emerged. The sedan couldn't be traced. The voices could not be verified. It was as if the city itself had swallowed Emily whole. The Hartman family clung to the officer's every word. Emily's mother sat in the living room, twisting tissues in her hands, waiting for an update that never seemed to come. Her father grew restless, pacing the hallway, volunteering to retrace the path again and again with officers. Her younger brother didn't understand. He asked if Emily was hiding, if she was playing some kind of game. Nobody could bring themselves to explain the truth to him. By Monday, the case had reached the evening news. Local reporters filmed from the block, microphones pointed at Emily's classmates, her teachers, her neighbors. Her school photo, the one where she was smiling in her 7th grade yearbook, became the face of every broadcast. Anchors spoke gravely into the camera. A 13-year-old girl vanished while walking home from school in Queens. Police are asking anyone with information to come forward. The story spread beyond Queens. Soon it was in the city papers, then the nightly national news. Everyone was talking about Emily Hartman. Tips poured in by the dozens, then the hundreds. Some were well-intentioned, others cruel, and many were simply the product of fear. A man on the corner swore he saw her with a stranger on the subway. A caller claimed she had been spotted in Manhattan with a group of older kids. Another anonymous tip said she had been taken to New Jersey. Detectives followed each one, but the results were always the same: dead ends. The first real suspicion fell close to home. Emily's parents had always insisted she was responsible, that she would never run away. But detectives knew that most disappearances started within a circle of familiarity. They asked the father pointed questions about his whereabouts. They pressed the mother for inconsistencies. It was routine, but devastating for the family, who felt accused when they were already broken. That early focus consumed precious time that could have been used chasing other leads. Then suspicion shifted outward. A neighbor, a man in his 30s who lived 2 houses down, became a person of interest after inconsistencies in his statements. He claimed he hadn't seen Emily that night, but another resident swore they saw him on the block at the exact time she vanished. Detectives brought him in for questioning, holding him for hours, grilling him about his history, his habits, his relationship with the Hartmans. But without evidence, no witness who could place him with Emily, no physical trace, he was released. His reputation never recovered. From that day forward, people whispered when he walked by. Another lead pointed to a classmate, a boy who had been known to bully Emily. His locker was searched. His family's home was combed through. Rumors spread that he had confessed to friends, but the truth was he had nothing to do with it. He was simply another name dragged into the desperate hunt for answers. As weeks became months, the fear grew into paranoia. In Queens, parents began tightening their grip on their children. Girls who once walked home together in groups were now picked up by cars. Curfews were imposed. Neighbors stopped trusting one another. Every unfamiliar car was suspicious. Every unfamiliar face was a potential threat. The community, once woven together by trust, began to fray. Through it all, the Hartman family lived in a kind of suspended animation. Emily's mother refused to change a single thing in her daughter's bedroom. The posters of pop stars on her wall, the stack of books on her nightstand, the half-finished homework in her backpack, it all remained frozen in time. Her father became obsessed with the case, creating binders filled with newspaper clippings, maps of the neighborhood, and handwritten notes from conversations with detectives. He believed fiercely that one small detail would one day break the case open. The media frenzy burned bright, then faded. Other stories rose in the headlines: political scandals, celebrity dramas, other crimes. Emily's case was still there, still reported on anniversaries, but the intensity dulled. For the Hartmans, though, it never dulled. Each anniversary was another year without answers. Each birthday was another day Emily didn't get to see. Detectives cycled through the case over the years, some more determined than others. New detectives brought fresh eyes, but often they circled back to the same old theories. It was a runaway. It was a stranger abduction. It was someone close to the family. Files were opened and closed, evidence reviewed and shelved. Nothing broke the stalemate. Technology, too, worked against them. In 1998, DNA analysis was still in its relative infancy. CCTV cameras were few and far between, mostly in businesses, not on every corner as they are today. The fibers, the prints, the small traces that were collected never pointed conclusively to anyone. Without a body, without a crime scene, the case drifted further and further into limbo. But the pain never left the Hartmans. Her mother became a quiet figure in the neighborhood, often seen lighting a candle in the church on the corner, whispering prayers into the flickering light. Her father aged quickly, his hair turning gray far sooner than it should have. Her younger brother grew up in the shadow of her absence, always compared to the sister who never came home. Years passed. Queens changed. Buildings were torn down, new ones built. The corner stores were replaced with coffee shops. Faces of neighbors came and went. But Emily's story lingered, like a ghost over the block. People still remembered the flyers on lampposts. They still remembered the search parties in the night. And they remembered the silence that followed when no answers came. For the detectives who remained haunted by the case, Emily's name was not just another file. It was a reminder of failure. They had combed every angle, interviewed hundreds, followed every lead, yet somehow the truth had slipped through their fingers. And then, eventually, the case was officially marked cold. The file was boxed, labeled, and stored away in a back room of the precinct. It sat there, collecting dust, while the world outside moved on. But for the Hartmans, moving on was impossible. Every knock on the door, every phone call, every unknown number carried the same desperate thought. Maybe this is it. Maybe they found her, and every time it wasn't. For more than 2 decades, Emily Hartman's disappearance lived in that painful limbo, not forgotten, but not solved, not alive, but not declared dead, just suspended. But here is where the story takes its cruel turn, and its astonishing turn. Because while the world moved forward, while new generations grew up in Queens never knowing Emily's name, one small piece of evidence, overlooked, dismissed, left in the back of an evidence box, still carried the answer. It sat quietly, waiting for the day when science would catch up, when determination would resurface, when someone would ask, "What if we missed something?" And that day would come, because decades later, one forgotten piece of evidence would resurface. And when it did, the truth about what happened to Emily Hartman would finally come crashing into the light. For more than 2 decades, the name Emily Hartman lived in silence. But then in the early 2020s, something remarkable happened. A new team of detectives in Queens reopened several old cold cases, determined to apply advances in forensic technology to files once thought unsolvable. Emily's case was one of them. The box was pulled from storage, the contents spread out once more on a table in a cramped office. Photographs yellowed with time, handwritten notes from long-retired officers, and bags of evidence that had not been touched in years. Among those items was a shirt Emily had been wearing the day she vanished. For years it had been logged, stored, and dismissed as inconclusive. In 1998, the technology simply wasn't powerful enough to pick apart the microscopic traces clinging to it. But now, with modern DNA analysis, even the smallest fragment of genetic material could reveal a story. The fabric was sent to a specialized lab. Weeks later, the results came back. What had once been a jumble of unidentified material was now crystal clear. A male DNA profile, strong and undeniable, hidden in the fibers. It wasn't Emily's. It wasn't a family member's. It belonged to someone who had been near her that night, someone who left a trace without realizing it. The profile was run through the national database. At first, nothing. But then, after being cross-referenced through a newer process, one that compared distant relatives, building family trees, narrowing possibilities, the computer hit a match. A name appeared, and when investigators saw it, they couldn't believe what they were reading. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a drifter who passed through Queens and disappeared. It wasn't the neighbor who had once been dragged into the station. It was someone who had been there the entire time. Someone who lived among the Hartman's grief, who attended the same vigils, who helped staple flyers to telephone poles. It was a man who had once been trusted to walk the same streets Emily walked, a man who was part of the very fabric of the community. Detectives were stunned. For years, this man had been overlooked, treated as another friendly face in the crowd. He had no criminal record. He was known for lending a hand when neighbors needed it. He even volunteered at local events, sometimes shoulder to shoulder with Emily's grieving parents. Nobody suspected him, which is exactly why he was able to hide for so long. But DNA does not lie. The match was confirmed, and one morning, in a quiet Queens neighborhood, officers surrounded his home. Neighbors watched from their porches and windows as he was led out in handcuffs, his head lowered, the same man they had once waved to on the sidewalk. The arrest sent shockwaves through the entire community. People called each other in disbelief. Parents clutched their children a little tighter. How could it have been him all along? When Emily's parents received the call, they sat in silence. The name of the man accused of killing their daughter didn't seem real. Her mother covered her mouth with her hands. Her father collapsed into a chair. This was someone they had once spoken to, someone who had expressed sympathy for their pain. To learn that he had allegedly been the one responsible all along was a betrayal beyond comprehension. The case moved quickly once the arrest was made. The suspect was charged, and the courtroom became the stage where decades of anguish finally found a voice. The Hartman family attended every hearing, sitting quietly in the front row. Reporters filled the benches, scribbling notes as prosecutors laid out the story piece by piece. The DNA evidence was presented, airtight and damning. Experts explained how modern techniques had made it possible to link the profile to the defendant with absolute certainty. And then came the motive. In whispers and testimonies, the truth emerged. The man who had once seemed so harmless had noticed Emily. He had fixated on her, a child who trusted the world around her. That fixation turned into opportunity the night she walked home alone. Prosecutors painted the picture. He lured her into conversation, perhaps even offered her a ride. What followed was unthinkable. Emily never made it home because of him. The courtroom was heavy with emotion as the details unfolded. Emily's mother wiped tears from her eyes. Her father stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Jurors listened in silence, some visibly shaken. It wasn't just the crime itself that horrified them. It was the betrayal. This was a man who had lived among them, smiling, laughing, pretending, while carrying a secret so monstrous it could shatter an entire community. When the guilty verdict came, there was no celebration, only relief. Relief that after 25 years, the truth was finally spoken aloud. Relief that Emily's name was not just another unsolved case collecting dust in a box. Relief that justice, however delayed, had arrived. But along with that relief was sorrow. Sorrow that it had taken so long, that Emily's parents had grown old waiting, that her brother had grown up in her absence, that a whole generation had lived with fear, while the answer sat so close all along. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as the story spread across the country. Headlines read, "Cold case solved after 25 years, trusted neighbor convicted of killing 13-year-old girl." Reporters replayed footage of the arrest, juxtaposed with images of Emily's smiling school photo, and people everywhere asked themselves the same haunting question. If it could happen in Queens, in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, could it happen anywhere? For the Hartman family, closure was bittersweet. They had the truth, but it didn't bring Emily back. Her bedroom was still empty. Her laughter was still gone. Her absence was still a weight they carried every day. And yet, knowing the truth, knowing the man who had taken her could never harm anyone else, allowed them to take their first steps toward healing. Imagine if this was your child, and their case went unsolved for decades. Wouldn't you want people to care, to keep telling their story? Hit subscribe now, or explain in the comments why you'd rather look away from the truth. Because Emily's story is not just about a crime, it's about betrayal, about perseverance, about the relentless pursuit of justice, no matter how long it takes. And as long as her name is spoken, as long as her story is told, she will never be forgotten. The conviction was supposed to bring relief, and in many ways it did. But in Queens, what lingered afterward was not triumph. It was a silence, heavy and unshakable. Because the truth that emerged in the days after the verdict was far worse than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just that the man had lived among them all these years. It was that he had been with them, side by side in their grief, pretending to share their pain, while knowing all along what he had done. Neighbors began to remember details they had once overlooked. One recalled how he had been among the very first to offer his time when the search began, flashlight in hand, walking through vacant lots, calling Emily's name with what seemed like desperation. Another remembered seeing him stapling flyers to telephone poles, Emily's photo staring back at him, as if he too wanted her to come home. And perhaps most chilling, several people remembered him standing quietly near Emily's mother at vigils, bowing his head, his candle burning like everyone else's, his lips murmuring prayers for a girl he knew would never return. The betrayal cut deeper than anyone could describe, because when you look back and realize the predator was standing in the circle of light, holding the same candle as you, whispering the same words of hope, it shakes the very foundation of trust. It means that danger is not always hiding in the shadows. Sometimes it is standing beside you, disguised as a neighbor, a friend, a helper. Emily's mother admitted in a soft, trembling voice during one interview that she had once thanked him. After one of the longest search nights, when exhaustion weighed on everyone, she had turned to him and said, "I don't know how to keep going. Thank you for being here." And his response still echoed in her mind, "Don't give up. We'll find her." At the time, she believed those words were encouragement. Now she knew they had been something far more sinister, a mask, a performance. He hadn't been encouraging her to hope. He had been mocking her pain. The revelation hollowed the community. Because if this man who seemed so ordinary, so harmless, so kind, could do something like this, then what did that mean about everyone else they trusted? Parents who had once allowed their children to roam freely in the neighborhood now second-guessed every face they passed. Mothers who had once invited neighbors in for coffee now wondered what secrets lay behind the familiar smiles. Fathers who had once waved casually at men on the block now tightened their grips on their children's hands. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about the fragile illusion of safety. It was about realizing that evil does not always wear the face of a stranger. Sometimes it wears the face of a neighbor who volunteers at community events, who says hello on the sidewalk, who seems as ordinary as anyone else. That realization is what shook Queens the hardest. And yet, for all the horror of that betrayal, there was also the small, bitter relief of answers. After 25 years, Emily was no longer just a question mark. She was not a forgotten file in the back of a cabinet. She was a daughter, a sister, a child whose story had finally been told. The Hartmans were finally able to give her the kind of goodbye she had been denied for decades. At her final memorial service, hundreds gathered again in the same park where the earliest vigils had been held. Candles flickered against the evening sky, and Emily's face, her school photo with that shy smile, was projected on a screen. But this time, the air carried something different. Not the frantic hope of the early years, not the heavy silence of the cold case years, but something quieter, a mixture of grief, resilience, and closure. Her brother, now grown, stood before the crowd and spoke. He talked about the sister he lost, the way she used to sit on the floor with him and play board games, the way she always saved part of her dessert to give to him, the way her laugh would echo through their small house. He admitted that growing up without her had shaped everything in his life, that every milestone, birthdays, graduations, holidays, had carried a shadow. But now, he said, at least they had the truth. At least they could speak her name without wondering, without the unbearable weight of the unknown. Her parents, older now, frailer, but still standing strong, thanked the community for never giving up on their daughter. Her mother's voice broke as she said that even in the darkest years, when the world seemed to forget, she clung to the hope that someday Emily's name would be spoken again. And now, with the truth uncovered, she prayed her daughter could finally rest. But even as candles glowed and tears fell, there was a haunting awareness among those gathered. Justice had come far too late. Emily never had the chance to grow up, to chase her dreams, to live the life she deserved. Her parents spent half their lives waiting. Her brother grew up without her. The years that could have been filled with laughter and love were instead filled with silence, with questions, with grief. So the question lingered, heavier than any verdict, sharper than any sentence. Was justice truly served, or was it far too late? The legal system had done its part. A guilty man was behind bars. The case was officially solved. But justice is not just about punishment. It is about time, about truth arriving when it still matters, about protecting others before more harm can be done. And in that sense, Emily's case revealed a flaw that cannot be ignored. Because what about the other families still waiting? What about the countless boxes still collecting dust in evidence rooms? What about the parents who, even tonight, are staring at the door, waiting for a child who will never walk through it? Emily's story may have found its ending, but theirs remains unwritten. The community learned a painful lesson, that safety is fragile, that trust can be shattered, that justice, when delayed, carries scars that never fade. But they also learned something else, that persistence matters, that technology can rewrite the past, that silence can be broken, even after decades. And as the candles burned low at Emily's final service, her name was spoken again and again, not as a tragedy, but as a reminder to watch, to care, to remember. A reminder that behind every missing poster, behind every headline, there is a family who refuses to stop hoping. Emily Hartman will never be forgotten. Her story will not fade into the background of history. Because even in the cruel delay, even in the unbearable betrayal, her truth came to light. But the haunting question remains, and perhaps it always will. Was justice truly served, or was it far too late? And now, here we are. After nearly an hour together, walking through decades of unanswered questions, dead ends, heartbreak, and finally, a revelation that no one in Queens ever expected, we've reached the end of Emily Hartman's story. But the truth is, her story doesn't end here. It lingers. It lingers in every empty bedroom where posters never came down. It lingers in every corner of Queens where parents walk their children home just a little faster because they've learned what can happen in the space of a single night. And it lingers in every cold case file stacked on shelves across America, where names just like Emily's are still waiting, still hoping, still silenced. So I need to ask you, what does justice really look like when it arrives decades too late? Is justice a prison sentence for the guilty, even if they lived free for 25 years? Is it the truth finally coming to light, no matter how late? Or is true justice only what Emily never got? Safety, protection, and the chance to grow up. Because here's the haunting reality. For families like the Hartmans, justice is never clean. They finally know the name of the person who took their daughter's life. They finally have a courtroom verdict. They finally have closure, or at least the closest thing to closure that this world offers. And yet it doesn't fix the empty chair at the dinner table. It doesn't erase birthdays that were never celebrated, or holidays that passed in silence. It doesn't restore the childhood that was stolen. And so I ask you again, was justice truly served, or was it far too late? Think about this carefully, because the uncomfortable truth is that Emily's case isn't unique. Across the country, thousands of cold cases sit untouched, with families waiting, just like Emily's did, year after year, clinging to hope while the world forgets them. Many of these families may never see the breakthrough Emily's family finally received, and that reality should make us pause. Now some of you might be asking, could this tragedy have been prevented? Could Emily have been saved if the investigation in 1998 had been sharper, if the resources had been stronger, if neighbors had been more alert, if technology had been what it is today? The hard answer is, maybe. The fibers of her shirt that eventually cracked this case were always there, but science wasn't advanced enough to read their secret. And so, while Emily's parents grew old in grief, her killer lived free. Think about that. And now think about this. How many other cases right now hold the same overlooked clue, the same forgotten scrap of evidence, the same locked-away truth, waiting for someone to care enough to revisit it? This is why we tell these stories. Not to shock you, not to sensationalize tragedy, but to remind you that behind every missing poster, every cold file, there's a family who deserves answers. And they may never get them unless we keep remembering, keep asking, keep pressing. So let me put this directly to you. What do you believe justice looks like after decades? Do you think it's enough to put someone in prison at the end of their life, when the bulk of their years were lived free? Or is true justice something that must happen sooner? Something society owes to its children before the harm is ever done? Let's go one step further. Could this have been prevented if communities paid more attention? If neighbors trusted their instincts when something felt wrong? If law enforcement had more resources to pursue every lead? Could it be prevented today, in your town, on your street, with your children? I want you to answer me in the comments. Don't just listen and move on. Reflect, engage. Because when we ignore these questions, we allow history to repeat itself. And if Emily's story has stayed with you, if it pulled at you, unsettled you, if it made you stop and think about your own loved ones, then stay with us. Because there are more cases like hers, and some of them are still unsolved. In our next episode, we'll uncover another story of a life cut short, another family left in the dark, and another shocking twist that no one ever saw coming. If you thought this case was haunting, the next one will shake you to your core. But before I go, I have to say this plainly. If you've watched this far and you still haven't subscribed, Why? Families like Emily's waited a lifetime for the truth. They lived with pain that stretched across decades, and when their day of justice finally came, it only arrived because people refused to let her name be forgotten. If you can't even click a button to honor that fight, then maybe type in the comments and tell me why. Because I promise you, I'll be reading. And I want you to hear me clearly. This isn't about boosting numbers. It's about memory. Subscribing means refusing to let these names vanish. It means saying, I will not look away. It means ensuring that the next Emily, the next family, the next story doesn't fade into silence. Because silence is deadly. Silence is what predators count on. Silence is why so many of these cases go cold. And silence is what destroys families long after the crime has been committed. Subscribing, liking, sharing. Those are the small actions that tell families they are not alone. That their child's life mattered. That their pain mattered. So, hit subscribe right now. Don't scroll past this. Don't let Emily's name disappear into another forgotten headline. And if you won't, if you can't bring yourself to do it, then tell us why in the comments. Because if you cared enough to watch this far, you care enough to answer. Emily Hartman was only 13 years old. She was supposed to come home that night. And though justice finally came, it came far too late. But by remembering her, by speaking her name, by keeping her story alive, we make sure she is never truly gone. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. Thank you for remembering Emily. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and never forget, behind every headline, there is a family who never stopped waiting for the truth. Because here's the haunting reality. For families like the Hartmans, justice is never clean. They finally know the name of the person who took their daughter's life. They finally have a courtroom verdict. They finally have closure, or at least the closest thing to closure that this world offers. And yet, it doesn't fix the empty chair at the dinner table. It doesn't erase birthdays that were never celebrated, or holidays that passed in silence. It doesn't restore the childhood that was stolen. And so I ask you again, was justice truly served, or was it far too late? Think about this carefully, because the uncomfortable truth is that Emily's case isn't unique. Across the country, thousands of cold cases sit untouched, with families waiting, just like Emily's did, year after year, clinging to hope while the world forgets them. Many of these families may never see the breakthrough Emily's family finally received, and that reality should make us pause. Now, some of you might be asking, could this tragedy have been prevented? Could Emily have been saved if the investigation in 1998 had been sharper, if the resources had been stronger, if neighbors had been more alert, if technology had been what it is today? The hard answer is, maybe. The fibers of her shirt that eventually cracked this case were always there, but science wasn't advanced enough to read their secret. And so, while Emily's parents grew old in grief, her killer lived free. Think about that. And now think about this. How many other cases right now hold the same overlooked clue, the same forgotten scrap of evidence, the same locked-away truth, waiting for someone to care enough to revisit it? This is why we tell these stories, not to shock you, not to sensationalize tragedy, but to remind you that behind every missing poster, every cold file, there's a family who deserves answers, and they may never get them unless we keep remembering, keep asking, keep pressing. So let me put this directly to you. What do you believe justice looks like after decades? Do you think it's enough to put someone in prison at the end of their life, when the bulk of their years were lived free? Or is true justice something that must happen sooner? Something society owes to its children before the harm is ever done? Let's go one step further. Could this have been prevented if communities paid more attention? If neighbors trusted their instincts when something felt wrong? If law enforcement had more resources to pursue every lead? Could it be prevented today, in your town, on your street, with your children? I want you to answer me in the comments. Don't just listen and move on. Reflect. Engage. Because when we ignore these questions, we allow history to repeat itself. And if Emily's story has stayed with you, if it pulled at you, unsettled you, if it made you stop and think about your own loved ones, then stay with us. Because there are more cases like hers, and some of them are still unsolved. In our next episode, we'll uncover another story of a life cut short, another family left in the dark, and another shocking twist that no one ever saw coming. If you thought this case was haunting, the next one will shake you to your core. But before I go, I have to say this plainly. If you've watched this far, and you still haven't subscribed, why? Families like Emily's waited a lifetime for the truth. They lived with pain that stretched across decades, and when their day of justice finally came, it only arrived because people refused to let her name be forgotten. If you can't even click a button to honor that fight, then maybe type in the comments and tell me why. Because I promise you, I'll be reading, and I want you to hear me clearly. This isn't about boosting numbers. It's about memory. Subscribing means refusing to let these names vanish. It means saying, I will not look away. It means ensuring that the next Emily, the next family, the next story doesn't fade into silence. Because silence is deadly. Silence is what predators count on. Silence is why so many of these cases go cold. And silence is what destroys families long after the crime has been committed. Subscribing, liking, sharing, those are the small actions that tell families they are not alone, that their child's life mattered, that their pain mattered. So hit subscribe right now. Don't scroll past this. Don't let Emily's name disappear into another forgotten headline, and if you can't bring yourself to do it, then tell us why in the comments. Because if you cared enough to watch this far, you care enough to answer. Emily Hartman was only 13 years old. She was supposed to come home that night. And though justice finally came, it came far too late. But by remembering her, by speaking her name, by keeping her story alive, we make sure she is never truly gone. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. Thank you for remembering Emily. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and never forget, behind every headline, there is a family who never stopped waiting for the truth. I want you to answer me in the comments. Don't just listen and move on. Reflect. Engage. Because when we ignore these questions, we allow history to repeat itself. And if Emily's story has stayed with you, if it pulled at you, unsettled you, if it made you stop and think about your own loved ones, then stay with us. Because there are more cases like hers, and some of them are still unsolved. In our next episode, we'll uncover another story of a life cut short, another family left in the dark, and another shocking twist that no one ever saw coming. If you thought this case was haunting, the next one will shake you to your core. But before I go, I have to say this plainly. If you've watched this far, and you still haven't subscribed, why? Families like Emily's waited a lifetime for the truth. They lived with pain that stretched across decades, and when their day of justice finally came, it only arrived because people refused to let her name be forgotten. If you can't even click a button to honor that fight, the ton maybe type in the comments and tell me why. Because I promise you, I'll be reading. And I want you to hear me clearly. This isn't about boosting numbers, it's about memory. Subscribing means refusing to let these names vanish. It means saying, I will not look away. It means ensuring that the next Emily, the next family, the next story doesn't fade into silence. Because silence is deadly. Silence is what predators count on. Silence is why so many of these cases go cold. And silence is what destroys families long after the crime has been committed. Subscribing, liking, sharing, those are the small actions that tell families they are not alone, that their child's life mattered, that their pain mattered. So hit subscribe right now. Don't scroll past this. Don't let Emily's name disappear into another forgotten headline. And if you can't bring yourself to do it, then tell us why in the comments, because if you cared enough to watch this far, you care enough to answer. Emily Hartman was only 13 years old. She was supposed to come home that night. And though justice finally came, it came far too late. But by remembering her, by speaking her name, by keeping her story alive, we make sure she is never truly gone. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. Thank you for remembering Emily. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and never forget, behind every headline, there is a family who never stopped waiting for the truth.